Tomorrow, The Legend of Heroes Trails of Cold Steel 3 will be launching in the West. But before we all head back to Ouroboros and enroll at the Thor's branch campus, I thought now would be a good time for a refresher course. Some of us have gone through the first 2 Cold Steel games as recently as this year, but others have had to wait a while. Some may have last played Cold Steel 2 when the PC version launched in early 2018, and others may have been waiting as many as 3 years, dating back to the launch of the PS3 and Vita versions in the West. But regardless of how long the wait has been for you, it is nearly over. Before we begin, I want to be clear that this video is simply a refresher meant to recap the late game moments of Cold Steel 2, and highlight some loose threads that will be pertinent to Cold Steel 3. It's not a summary of the arc's entirety, nor is it a replacement for having played any other Trails games yourself. With that said, class is back in session. Let's begin. Starting with the appearance of the Infernal Castle, things became rather chaotic quickly in Ouroboros. Atop the castle, Class 7 finally had their face-off with Crow, Vita, and Duke Cayenne. You would think everyone's motivations would be crystal clear during this climax, but they're not. The main villains sit atop the Infernal Castle on the precipice of awakening the Vermilion Apocalypse. However, multiple times Vita expressly forbade Duke Cayenne from doing so. So what was the purpose of kidnapping Crown Prince Cedric and making the castle appear, if not to awaken the Vermilion Apocalypse? Well, if you recall, Vita said that her only interest was the battle between Ashen and Azure. Of course, Rean won said battle, Duke Cayenne panicked, and just as Vita forbade him to do, he shoved Cedric into Testarossa and awoke the Vermilion Apocalypse anyway. Under peril, Class 7 and Crow reunited, alongside Vita, and fought back the Vermilion Apocalypse with Rean and Crow piloting Valimar and Ordine to finish the job. But victory came with a cost. Crow was stabbed through the heart and lost his life. Coming as a surprise to literally no one, enter Gileath Osborne from stage right. Yes, Osborne was alive the whole time, which you already knew if you played Trails to Azure, and Rufus Albareo was actually the top Ironblood, meaning the Noble Alliance was doomed from the very start. Osborne proved what longtime fans knew all along, which is that no one in Ouroboros is a better chess master than him. He even told Vita to slither back to Ouroboros, and let them know that he will be taking over the Phantasmal Blaze plan. So Rean, dealing with the death of his best friend whom he fought all game to try and take back, lost control and lashed out at the man Crow lived his life trying to kill. That's when he found out Chancellor Osborne is actually Papa Osborne. Yeah, that entire time in Cold Steel 1 and 2, you were actually playing as Osborne Jr., which is a fun little reveal for anyone who has gone through the series in order and had to put up with all of Osborne's antics prior to the start of Cold Steel. At that point, Cold Steel 2 essentially ended, by which I mean it went on for another 5 to 10 hours. Up next was the divertissement, also known as, I hope you played the Crossbell arc and know who these characters are. Crossbell is now officially part of the Empire. How it is Calvert let that happen despite the Erebonian Civil War still technically going on at the time the Azure Tree disappeared, no one knows. But regardless, Crossbell State is now the Crossbell Province, and Rufus is its first Governor General. That brought us to Lloyd Bannings of the Crossbell Police, and Rishia Mao, Arc and Seal Performer / Eastern Assassin. Lloyd and Rishia's mission was to traverse the Geofront Z block in order to access a terminal that held sensitive information on Crossbell's citizens and keep it out of the hands of the Imperial government. But the real purpose of this chapter wasn't that. The divertissement's real purpose was for Lloyd and Rean to meet each other for the first time, fight, and for Falcom to juxtapose just where its 2 most recent Trails heroes stand after their concurrently running journeys over the course of the year 1204. On one side you have Lloyd. Lloyd's time in the spotlight is effectively over at the end of Trails to Azure, and his growth as a character complete. I won't go into details for those of you who haven't played the Crossbell arc yet, which, by the way, you really should. But at the end of Azure, Lloyd and his companions were met with an impossible barrier to climb, and a choice no one wants to face. Ultimately, he and his allies made the brave and just choice. They were able to successfully resolve the Azure Tree incident, however, doing so left Crossbell defenseless. They understood what the consequences of that would be, and that occupation would be inevitable after what Crossbell had done in the wake of declaring independence. You know, destroying Guerrilla Fortress and putting up that magic barrier and all. Still, they took the more difficult path because it was the right thing to do, even if it meant more trying times ahead. This resolve is what ultimately defines Lloyd and his allies as heroes. And then you have Rean. Though they're hardly identical, Rean's journey does hold similarities with Lloyd's. Over the course of Cold Steel 1 and 2, Rean made new loved ones, grew as a martial artist, had his life turned inside out by a national incident, was isolated from his closest allies, struggled to reunite with them, and fought to take back his home. But at the very end of this journey, Rean was met with something he had no way of coping with. And in the face of this revelation, Rean crumbled. There's this great conversation Rean has early on in Cold Steel 1 with instructor Sarah. When urging Rean to take a more active role in the class and explaining why she singled him out to help the student council, Sarah says the following.
But if you don't plant yourself somewhere, you're just gonna blow away with the next big gust that comes along.
It's one of the more prophetic moments in the first half of the arc. Despite all games saying that Class 7 and the Courageous were a third faction and impartial in the Civil War, they played right into the hands of Osborn and the Ironbloods. Despite trying to be neutral, Rean quickly found himself becoming the Ashen Chevalier. After all he'd been through, all the struggles, all the battles, all the growth as a person, Rean became a tool for the Imperial government, a tool for the father that abandoned him as a child, a tool for the man his best friend did everything in his power to stop. The weight of that reality is full bore in the divertissement. By seeing just what the difference between Rean and Lloyd is at this point, and seeing Rean's own envy of Lloyd, it becomes clear just where Rean is halfway through the arc, and how somber Cold Steel 2's ending is meant to be. Trails of Cold Steel 2's epilogue chapter is one of the most bizarre times in the entire series. I say bizarre because of how strangely written and explained the largest plot point of it is. The fact that Class 7 is dissolving, and all its members, save for Rean, are leaving Thors. The same even goes for Sarah, who has handed in her letter of resignation and is returning to the Bracer Guild. The students did in fact graduate early, which, to be honest, could have been written more clearly in Cold Steel 2, but that still begs the question, why did Class 7 leave early? Well, there's the storytelling reason, and then there's the in-universe reasons, which depending on the character can come across as legitimate or half-baked. Some members of Class 7 had extremely valid reasons for leaving Thors after just 1 year. Take Eustace for example. With his brother now Crossbell's Governor General, and his father still under house arrest, someone had to run the day-to-day operations of the Croatian province. It made sense that Milliam's assignment at Thors was over. Elisa taking up post at the Reinford Company to begin the rebuilding process there was logical. So too was it that Emma would have no reason to stay, since her duty of guiding the Ashen Awakener had already been fulfilled, and she now had the goal of finding Vita. Rean stayed in Trista and completed his second year at Thors. But that had a lot less to do with him wanting to finish his education than it did with it simply being convenient for the Imperial government. By staying in Trista, they were easily able to ship him and Valimar out to anywhere in the Empire at a moment's notice. But forget all of this in-universe explaining. The real reason for all of these things ties back to what I explained for the divertissement. Cold Steel 2's ending is supposed to be somber. You're meant to get a heavy dose of a depressed and isolated Rean, Class 7 breaking up, and uncertainty toward the events of the future, the second half of the arc that's about to come out in the West. Given that the entire second act of the game was all about taking Thors back, the fact that their time at the Academy is over in a flash really drives home how despondent the ending is meant to be. For as much criticism as I occasionally give Cold Steel 2, and this epilogue in particular, I think that's a good design choice. Have you ever heard of the theory of the hero's journey? If you haven't, look it up on Wikipedia. I've long held that Rean has been going on this very traditional storytelling path, but he's been doing it over the course of the entire Erebonia arc, and not just in a single game. In other words, where you could see the same kind of story told in a 2-hour movie, or in a book you could finish in a weekend, This one is taking 300 hours of JRPG gameplay released over the span of 5 years. The consequence of that is that Cold Steel 2 in particular is leaving Rean off at an odd point in that journey. We're just beginning the descent down into Rean's challenges and temptations towards the abyss. As such, you'd expect this game to end on a very solemn note. If you're wondering exactly what the final dungeon was, or why it appeared at all, well, the explanation given by the game is that the Infernal Castle's disappearance had an effect on the Empire's spirit veins, which triggered a secondary trial to appear in the old schoolhouse, 3 months after the fact. It's a rather loose explanation, and what it comes down to is Falcom had to find some way to insert a final dungeon into the epilogue, though it seems kind of hasty. Hence, the dungeon is mostly random, you can infinitely farm out rare quartz, and Loa Luciferia is just a reskin of Loa Erebonius. Loa Luciferia himself tells you that he is a hollow trial, and defeating him is meaningless. And some people wonder why Cold Steel 2's ending gets so much criticism. But for the most part, this dungeon is about Falcom trying to end Class 7's journey on a high note. One underwhelming boss fight later, and you got your obligatory sad moment when the party members realized it was all over. Milliam cried, which the significance of was completely lost on you if you didn't happen to see that one bonding event in which she said she had never cried before. Crow's ghost showed up. And finally they said their goodbyes in front of Trista's station a few days later, followed by your stock JRPG credits and in-screen photograph of everyone together. It's like, thematically, Falcom knew Cold Steel 2's end was supposed to be a bit depressing, but they tried to give players a happy ending anyway because who doesn't like happy endings? There's also the matter of Cold Steel 2's secret New Game Plus scene that I made a video about earlier this year. Go on, I'll give you a few seconds to pause the video and do that if you don't know what I'm referring to. Yeah, so Thomas Lysander being the Gralsritter's second Dominion is going to come up pretty early in Cold Steel 3, but that wasn't the only worthwhile thing to learn about in that scene. The story of the Erebonia arc centers around two, yes, count 'em, two Septirians that existed in the land Erebonia stands on before the Great Collapse. If you read the Black Records in Cold Steel 2, you picked up on that in the first volume. Link in the description below to read those on the Kiseki wiki if you haven't already. Those two Septirians also happen to be described as great celestial titans, the shell of one of which is the Colossus in the Nord Highlands. The other is said to be located on Brionia Island, off of Erebonia's northwest shore. The secrets behind the Divine Knights are directly linked to this point, and so is all the vague talk you've heard in the last two games about a great power and a great one. As I said in that New Game Plus video, the Divine Knights are frequently referred to as fragments of the Great Power. The Great Power, as described by Volume 1 of the Black Records, was what was left behind as a result of the two Septirians' clash. And finally, Valimar says that the key to all is the Great One, the first to be born and the last to stand. You could call this the core of Cold Steel's story, and if you think you really don't know much about it after 2 games, well, you'd be right. The first half of the arc was the proverbial tip of the iceberg. It's important, it's where this arc is ultimately headed, but there are so many more loose threads than that. Did you stop to read about Erebonia's folklore in the first 2 games? You know, I'm a pretty big proponent for reading the game's books and newspapers in case you hadn't heard. In all seriousness, if you did, then you got the foreshadowing of the Hexen clan and gnomes long before either were mentioned in the story. The Hexen clan are, of course, the witches that Emma and Vita belong to. The gnomes, if you'll recall, are the artisans that design much of the fantastical technology you see in Erebonia that actually postdates the Great Collapse. That would include the old schoolhouse, the spirit shrines, and the Divine Knights themselves. It's crazy to think, but yes, technology that advanced was designed in between the Great Collapse and the Orbital Revolution. Thomas described the Divine Knights as a system fashioned by the witches and gnomes.
Has the truth finally dawned on you? The fragments of the Great Power are destined to be drawn to one another, forced to collide over and over and over. These dark times Erebonia is going through have repeated themselves since time immemorial, And every time, the truth of what happened disappears from the memories of all. That is how this system works.
In fact, he explicitly said there are 7 Divine Knights. We've seen 3 thus far, and also read about the Palatinate Knight in the Black Records. Where that knight and the other 3 yet to be identified are, who their awakeners may be, or if they've even been awoken at all, are some of the biggest questions still to be answered. Given we've seen firsthand how much knowledge the Hexen clan has of the Knights compared to anyone else, and know the gnomes crafted the Knights, it's easy to see we still have much to learn about each clan as we do the Knights themselves, especially the gnomes. We can't even conclusively say we've met anyone that belongs to the gnomes, or whether they're still around at all, like the Hexen clan. All we do know is that their engineering capabilities are inscrutably advanced for their time period. Ah yes, the Black Workshop. If you were paying attention and thorough in playing Cold Steel 2, this name came up a handful of times, most notably when speaking to Altina aboard the Pantagruel. Speaking to Milliam aboard the Courageous at the very start of Act 2 also yields a hidden scene about it for you. The Black Workshop is responsible for the making of the rifle Crow used to fake his death and shoot Osborn, as well as the manufacturing of the combat shells, Eric Getlam, and Clem Soleus. But if that weren't enough to make it noteworthy, it also serves as one of Ouroboros' 13 factories. Or rather, it did up until Osborn took it over like he did the Phantasmal Blaze plan. High-powered weaponry aside, what really makes the workshop interesting is whatever relation Milliam and Altina have to it. The girl's origins are still a mystery, and that's to say nothing of Eric Getlam and Clem Soleus. How or why one of the 13 factories would betray Ouroboros and side with the Chancellor should be one of the biggest questions you're asking yourself heading into Cold Steel 3. Hopefully you brought Fee and Sarah with you to the boss fight against Zio and Leonidas in the Infernal Castle. If you did, well, there was some interesting dialogue at the end of that exchange. If you recall, Fee was adopted by Zephyr's Jaeger King, Rutger Quassel, a name you only learn if you took Sarah to that fight. Rutger Quassel died 1 year before Cold Steel 1 and 2 in a clash with the War God, the leader of the Red Constellation Jaeger Corps, and father to a certain Thor's Branch campus instructor. Seriously, play the crossbow arc. Before the fight, Zio and Leonidas told Fee that the Corps left her behind after their boss's death because that was his will. Even Fee meeting and being taken in by Sarah was what he wanted for her all along. After the fight, they tell her that the other members of Zephyr are still active and acting separately from the war to bring back the boss. You don't get much more than that, and it's certainly a confusing note to end this topic on. Sarah reaffirmed that she saw the Jaeger King and War God die with her own eyes, and so did Fee. So how exactly Zephyr plans to bring their boss back is a good question. If you've keenly been paying attention to some of the themes and oddities happening in this arc's past and present, you may already have an idea as to what's going on here. Needless to say, this is a topic you'll be revisiting in the very near future. Lest we forget, the Erebonia arc, assuming you played the 5 games that preceded it, began under the pretense of learning just what Ouroboros' Phantasmal Blaze plan entails. After 2 whole games, we learned that, well, we didn't learn much. I already went over how confusing Vita's motivations in the finale were, and that her intention in summoning the Infernal Castle was to witness the battle between Ashen and Azure, and not to awaken the Vermilion Apocalypse. But let's also not forget that Vita is not the only Inguis running the show. There is also the 7th Inguis, the Steel Maiden, aka Duvali's Lord and the bane of everyone playing Trails to Azure on Nightmare's existence. Aryan Road, as she's otherwise known, is one of the strongest people on the continent, and bears a striking resemblance to the Lance Maiden of War of the Lions fame. In fact, Duvali even proclaimed that her master and the Lance Maiden are one and the same, despite the Lance Maiden having lived over 250 years ago. Together, her and Vita are supposed to lead the command of the Phantasmal Blaze plan, well, up until Ozzy hijacked it. And since we don't know a lot about what Phantasmal Blaze is or was, we also don't know what Osborn taking it over actually means. However, we can deduce from Vita's actions and knowing Ouroboros' history that it has something to do with the Divine Knights, and thus the two Septarians. As for what Osborn taking it over means, or why he'd want to, well, that's the whole plot of the second half of the arc, now isn't it? Trails of Cold Steel 3's Western release has been a long time coming. In the 3 years since Cold Steel 2 made its English debut, PC and PS4 ports of Cold Steel 1 and 2 have come out. A grand total of 5 Falcom games have gotten English releases, including Trails in the Sky the Third. And significant progress has been made by multiple fan groups in bringing the Crossbell arc to the West in an unofficial capacity. The series has also changed Western publishers, made the jump onto a current generation console, with PS4 Pro support I might add, and the arc has already concluded in Japan with a 4th game. There's also the fact the next Kiseki is already confirmed to be in development, and while it may not release under the Sin no Kiseki banner, it will still very much involve the characters from this arc. A lot has happened these last 3 years. We're all a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and hopefully a lot more ready for this game after watching this video. As we all set to embark, please remember to keep yourself and your fellow players spoiler-free. Be thorough in your work, and do be sure to take your time. So, go forward relentlessly, and as always, I expect only the best of each of you. Class dismissed.